The dust of the Second World War has barely settled, and yet the guns have not gone silent. It is July 1946. Near the small village of Anping, halfway around the world from Washington, D.C., a convoy of United States Marines is suddenly ambushed. Bullets tear through the humid summer air. Several Americans fall dead. The attackers are not rogue bandits, nor are they Japanese holdouts. They are soldiers of the Chinese Communist Party. In our timeline, this real and largely forgotten skirmish was swept under the rug. The United States, exhausted from years of global slaughter, chose to de-escalate. They packed up, went home, and left China to its fate. But history is often decided on a razor's edge. What if the reaction had been different? What if President Harry Truman, looking at the map of a fragile post-war world, decided that the United States could not afford to lose Asia to communism? What if, instead of a quiet withdrawal, the ambush at Anping became the spark that ignited American military retaliation? This is the story of the war that never was. A story of American troops marching into the endless expanse of the Chinese mainland, of a terrified Soviet Union watching from the north, and of a world dragged to the precipice of World War III before the ashes of the Second World War had even grown cold. The power vacuum of Asia. To understand how easily this could have happened, we must look at the powder keg that was post-war China. In 1945, the sudden collapse of the Japanese Empire left a massive, continent-sized power vacuum. For decades, China had been torn apart by warlords, foreign invasion, and a bitter, simmering civil war between two irreconcilable forces. The Nationalist government, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, and the Communist insurgency, led by Mao Zedong. During the war against Japan, these two sides had formed a fragile, deeply suspicious alliance. But the moment the Japanese surrendered, the race was on. Millions of soldiers scrambled to seize territory, weapons, and cities. The United States, desperate to prevent a full-blown civil war, dispatched its most respected military mind, General George C. Marshall, to broker a peace treaty. For months, Marshall tried to negotiate the impossible. He sat at tables with nationalist generals in silk uniforms and communist commanders in plain cotton tunics, trying to stitch together a coalition government. But the hatred ran too deep. By the summer of 1946, the truce was unraveling. The Nationalists held the major southern cities and the backing of the West. But they were plagued by rampant corruption and a collapsing economy. The Communists, meanwhile, were entrenched in the countryside, winning the hearts of the desperate peasantry and quietly receiving surrendered Japanese weapons from the Soviet Red Army in Manchuria. In our history, Marshall realized the situation was hopeless and advised Truman to cut America's losses. But in this alternate timeline, the ambush at Anping changes the calculus in Washington. Hardliners in the Pentagon and Congress seize the narrative. They argue that yielding China to Mao is effectively handing the keys of Asia to Joseph Stalin. Truman, feeling the immense pressure of a brewing Cold War, makes a fateful, catastrophic decision. He orders General Marshall to abandon diplomacy. The United States will commit its military might to ensure the survival of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. The Rubicon is crossed, the American escalation. At first, the intervention seems like a straightforward extension of American dominance. The U.S. Navy moves aircraft carriers into the Bohai Sea. American logistics networks, perfected during the Pacific War, flood nationalist ports with artillery, tanks, and ammunition. But hardware alone is not enough. And soon, American boots are hitting the ground. By late 1946, tens of thousands of U.S. Marines and Army infantrymen are deployed to secure major railways, ports, and industrial centers in northern China and Manchuria. The plan is theoretically simple. American forces will act as an impenetrable anvil, holding the critical infrastructure while Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist armies act as the hammer, sweeping through the countryside to crush Mao's rural Soviets. For a brief moment, it looks like a triumph. American B-29 superfortresses, the same terrifying machines that burned Tokyo to the ground, begin bombing communist strongholds in Yan'an. Under the umbrella of overwhelming U.S. air superiority, the Nationalists make massive territorial gains. Mao's forces are battered, bleeding, and forced into a desperate retreat into the deep, unforgiving interior of northern China. But this early success is an illusion. The American military is walking blind into a trap that will come to define the 20th century. The nightmare of asymmetrical guerrilla warfare. Mao Zedong knows he cannot defeat the United States Army in a pitched battle, so he refuses to fight one. He trades space for time, drawing the overextended American and nationalist forces deeper into the vast, hostile Chinese countryside. Communist guerrillas sever the very railway lines the Americans are trying to protect. Supply convoys are ambushed in the dead of night. The American soldier, fresh off the victories of Europe and the Pacific, suddenly finds himself in an endless alien landscape, fighting an enemy that strikes from the shadows and melts back into the local peasantry. The scope of the theater is unfathomable. China is not a small peninsula like Korea, nor a localized jungle like Vietnam. It is a continent. To pacify it, the United States needs millions of men. But back home, the American public is clamoring for demobilization. The idea of drafting young men to die in the mountains of Manchuria just months after defeating Hitler in Tojo sparks outrage. Protests erupt in New York and Washington. The political willpower to sustain the war begins to fracture almost immediately. The bear awakes. But what happens next transforms a bloody quagmire into a global crisis. Joseph Stalin, watching from the Kremlin, is paralyzed with paranoia. To Stalin, an American army operating in Manchuria, right on the border of the Soviet Union, is an existential threat. He views it as a direct staging ground for a future invasion of Russia. Stalin cannot allow a U.S.-dominated capitalist China to exist on his vulnerable eastern flank. Yet, he also knows the Soviet Union, having lost 27 million people in World War II, cannot survive a direct war with the United States. Furthermore, in 1946, the Americans have a monopoly on the atomic bomb. Stalin does not. So, Stalin authorizes a massive covert escalation. The Soviet border is thrown wide open. Endless trains of heavy artillery, Katyusha rocket launchers, and winter gear flow into the hands of the Chinese communists. But Stalin goes further. Suddenly, American bomber pilots over Manchuria report being intercepted by advanced fighter planes. The planes bear Chinese insignias, but the pilots speak Russian over the radio. The proxy war turns scorching hot. Soviet artillery advisors embed themselves within Mao's ranks. Entire divisions of the Communist Army are secretly trained and equipped in Soviet Siberia before being unleashed back across the border. By the brutal winter of 1947, the tide begins to turn. The Nationalist Army, despite American backing, begins to fracture under its own corruption and the relentless, freezing assaults of a heavily armed, Soviet-backed communist force. American casualties begin to mount at an alarming rate. Entire companies of U.S. Marines find themselves cut off and besieged in freezing Manchurian cities, fighting desperately against waves of enemies armed with Soviet submachine guns. The situation is devolving from a peacekeeping mission into a desperate fight for survival. The brink of annihilation. By 1948, the American public is entirely disillusioned. The economy is straining under the weight of a war with no end in sight. Truman is facing a catastrophic political defeat at home. The Pentagon presents him with two terrifying options. Option 1, a humiliating, total withdrawal, abandoning Chiang Kai-shek and leaving behind thousands of American dead for nothing. Option 2. Do the unthinkable. Use the atomic bomb. Military commanders like General Douglas MacArthur, viewing the conflict from Tokyo, argue fiercely for the latter. They propose dropping atomic weapons on key communist mountain strongholds and along the Manchurian border to sever the Soviet supply lines. They argue that since the Soviets do not yet have the bomb, the United States can act with impunity. This is the ultimate crucible of the alternate timeline. Truman sits in the Oval Office, holding the power to vaporize hundreds of thousands of lives in an instant. If he drops the bomb, he crosses a moral event horizon. The United States would forever be known not just as the nation that ended World War II with nuclear fire, but as an empire that uses atomic weapons as standard tactical tools to enforce its political will. It would instantly legitimize Stalin's paranoia, ensuring that the moment the Soviets developed their own bomb, the world would plunge into an inevitable, apocalyptic nuclear exchange. The pressure is crushing, but Truman, recognizing that atomic fire will not win the hearts of the Chinese people, nor will it magically solve the logistical nightmare of occupying a continent, chooses the bitter pill of reality. He orders the withdrawal. It is a retreat far messier and more tragic than anything seen in our actual history. American forces fight bloody rearguard actions as they evacuate from coastal cities, trying to load desperate nationalist refugees onto ships bound for the island of Taiwan. The communist victory in China is delayed by perhaps 2 or 3 years. But the cost of that delay is staggering. The legacy of the war, or that never was. In this timeline, the Chinese Civil War ends not in 1949, but in the early 1950s. The mainland falls to Mao Zedong, just as it did in reality. But the world left in the wake of this American intervention is dark, fractured, and deeply traumatized. The United States enters the 1950s not as a booming, confident superpower, but as a divided, economically bruised nation. The myth of American military invincibility, earned on the beaches of Normandy, is shattered in the snows of Manchuria. The American public becomes fiercely isolationist, heavily distrustful of government intervention overseas. Consequently, when North Korea eventually invades South Korea, an exhausted America likely refuses to intervene, leaving the entire Korean peninsula to fall to communism. For China, the trauma is infinitely worse. The heavy American bombing and prolonged fighting leave the nation's infrastructure in absolute ruins. Mao Zedong emerges from the war far more radicalized, viewing the United States with a burning, fanatical hatred that permanently severs any hope of diplomatic normalization for generations. The echoes of that single decision, to fight for a lost cause in a land too vast to hold, would have reshaped the next half-century. It proves a fundamental law of geopolitics. Military might can conquer cities, and airplanes can destroy factories. But an intervening power cannot force a nation to accept a government it despises. In our timeline, the United States avoided the trap of the Chinese Civil War, preserving its strength for the long twilight struggle of the Cold War. But the ghosts of that alternate reality, the thousands of young Americans who might have frozen in Manchuria, and the millions of Chinese who might have died in a prolonged, mechanized proxy war, serve as a chilling reminder. Sometimes, the most important battles in history are the ones we choose not to fight. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe for more forgotten chapters of history.